This is one of my favorite videos to do, and I actually made this video a while ago, but I am going to be remaking it because I have a ton of new subscribers. So who doesn't want to rewire their brain using the Quran? Like, who doesn't want the Quran to be what shapes the way we think and the actions that we take? And so in this video, I am going to be teaching you 5 ways to rewire your brain using the Quran. Inshallah, it's going to be super, super cool, so stick around. And if you're new here, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hannah. I am a trauma coach who helps Muslim women heal from trauma. And I help them heal and build a beautiful life ahead of them. So if you are a Muslim woman who is interested in that, or you know someone, you can also go to the link in the description and learn about my program. I am actually accepting trauma group coaching program applicants for the upcoming cohort in 2025. So let's get started. I'm going to be looking over at my computer because I have a ton of notes to use, but we'll jump right into it, inshallah. Now, I want you to completely rethink your relationship with the Quran. And I want you to imagine that when you are reading the Quran, right, you're sitting down and you're reading the Quran. Don't read it like a book. I want you to imagine that it's a letter, right? Almost like it was a letter that was being directed to you. And I want you to sit there and think, as you're reading the Quran, what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling me in this moment? Because we read the Quran like it's some sort of history book, right? And we tend to forget that the verses that are being revealed to us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that on that day, in that moment, we are going to be reading those verses. Allah is al-alim. It's not a coincidence that you're coming across the verses that you're coming to. So I want you to start thinking in this moment, as I'm reading these verses of Quran, what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling me? What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicating to me? This is actually something that the Sahaba used to do when they were reading the Quran, right? When they would come across a verse, they would actually act upon it. Like, and in fact, even when they were memorizing the Quran, they wouldn't memorize the verse until they applied it. And example, right? If they came across a verse where the verse was saying, and repent upon your sins and, ask the forgiveness of Allah, then in that moment, the Sahaba would pause their recitation and they would make istighfar and they would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. They were interacting with the Quran as a living book, because that's what the Quran is. It is a living book. Its message reverberates throughout time. It's not constricted to time. So treat it like that, like it is a letter that is being spoken to you directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah is using that to communicate to us. Those are His words. And your brain gets to see this book as this personal message, and it completely changes your relationship with the Quran, right? Instead of thinking about it as a distant history book or something that is not relevant to you, right? And yes, there might be points of the Quran where it's describing someone else's story or someone else's story or someone else's experience. But from those stories and experiences come lessons and principles that apply to us at different points in our life. So that is the first way to rewire your brain using the Quran. What's another way? One thing you will notice in the Quran is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses a lot of labels. Like, you will find different descriptions for different types of people, right? As-sabirin, the patient, al-musallin, those who are, those who pray salah, al-mu'minin, al-kafirin, the believers and the disbelievers. There are so many labels that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses. And when you start coming across words that are a label, right, that label a certain group of people, I want you to start thinking to yourself, do I want to identify more with this label or less with this label? There is a wisdom behind the words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to use in the Quran. And it's because those labels demonstrate a collective that at any given time we can fall into, right? And so figuring out for ourselves, do we want to identify with those labels, is really important, because those labels come with certain attributes and certain characteristics that we might not even realize we have. And so, for example, right, oftentimes we hear the munafiqun, the hypocrites, being described in the Quran. Now, to be considered a hypocrite in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a very, very dangerous thing. And it might not be that you're a hypocrite or I'm a hypocrite, but it might be that we have elements of hypocrisy in us, that we hold certain aspects of us that are hypocritical, right? Maybe we expect things of other people Islamically that we don't expect. Maybe we say that we believe and then we do things that are actually aligning with someone who disbelieves. With that in mind, when those attributes continue over and over without our intervention, it's when we end up falling upon the label. When that label now can apply to us. In fact, there's a hadith that's super interesting that it's something along the lines of, a person will lie and lie and lie until in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is labeled a liar, right? We don't want that. So start thinking about when those labels come up. Not, am I a hypocrite? Because immediately our response is no, of course not. Am I a disbeliever? No, of course not. But do I have elements of hypocrisy? Am I doing actions or performing actions that align with disbelief more than belief? And when we do that, just give me a moment to plug in my laptop. This completely changes our sense of identity, right? Identity is such a huge part of how we view ourselves and how we show up in the world. And we can actually shift our identity, and that'll shift the way we think about things and the actions that we take. It's a really powerful coaching technique that can be used. It's used by high performance coaches all over the world. And inshallah, I think once you guys start reading the Quran that way, it's going to just change everything for you. Next, there are so many different stories in the Quran. There are so many different stories. There are stories of prophets. There are stories of, pious people. There are stories of people who weren't pious, right? So many different examples that we can look to. And there's actually this really cool neuroscience fact that a lot of people don't know. But our brain has a specific set of brain cells called mirror neurons. And these neurons they actually exist to help us take notice of another person who we're interacting with and what their emotions and like their state, their state is. We perceive that, and then we can reflect that, right? We notice those even down to the subtleties. Someone can be sad and the mirror neuron helps you identify, oh, they're sad. So let me not be all the way up here laughing and smiling. Let me bring it down. That's what our mirror neurons help us to do. And this is really interesting because it's almost like the stories of the Quran help us do the same thing, right? So the stories of the Quran are these numerous examples that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses of different types of people so that we can identify with that, and then we can use that perception to change the way we behave, the way we think, and the way we act. And so start thinking of, an example I'll give is when you come across the verses of Aisha and the slander of Aisha, right? Immediately, if you have been backbitten before, you're able to resonate with that pain. And on the other end of things, if you are someone who backbites or gossips about other people, immediately you're like, oh, I need to change the way that I do things, because the verses are around that instance of the slander of Aisha, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with her, are very, very harsh. Now, when you think about the example, the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and his interactions with his father, that is something that you might think about with your own parents. Or what are my interactions with my parents like? When you think about, if you're a Muslim who lives in the West and you feel out of place and disconnected and you're kind of struggling with your deen and you feel distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then you read the story of the youth of the cave from Surah Al-Kahf, immediately you're thinking, wow, subhanallah, this is an example of believers who felt the way I felt, and this is how they showed up, and maybe I can mimic that. Maybe I can take from those same principles and apply it to myself so I can show up in a way where I'm proud of my deen, where I'm doing things that don't sacrifice it, just like they did. All right. Next way to reprogram your brain. There's actually an entire subject. A lot of you guys might not know about this. It's called environmental psychology, and essentially this subject, or this branch of psychology, specifically looks at our surroundings, right, and how it affects our thinking and our thinking, feeling, and behavior. So if you are to walk into certain restaurants, for example, the way the chairs are set up, the colors on the walls, the way the menu is set up is not a coincidence, right? It is based on this idea of environmental psychology. The reason why I bring this up is because the place that we're in really has a big impact on our state of being and even the way we enjoy our experiences, right? And so start thinking about, where do you connect with the Quran? Like, where do you actually read the Quran? And one way you can apply this idea of an environmental psychology to rewire your brain is to have a dedicated space for worship. Now, this can be something that you beautify and you make it look all nice, and you have a pretty sajada and lights and a little bookshelf, and it can be really adorable. But just having a dedicated space, another element of environmental psychology, is when you choose a particular space and you do repetitive tasks in that space, your brain starts to, is able to remember things more. And additionally, you are more likely to engage in that behavior in that specific space because of conditioning. This is something I actually learned in undergrad many years ago when I was being advised on how to study, and our professor actually told us, you're going to study, pick one place that you typically study because it's going to help you with retention. Now, retention with Quran is really important because even if you're not memorizing, it's really, really helpful to remember the actual lessons. So that's the next way you can rewire your brain. We have one more way that I want to share with you, inshallah, and that is when you are reciting Quran. The way you recite is going to make a huge impact on how you feel. I don't mean how you feel emotionally. I mean how your nervous system feels. Let me explain, inshallah. The Prophet ﷺ tells us the way he used to recite, right? And we understand that his recitation needs to be very slow, very intentional. He really allowed himself to feel what he was reading. He really reflected on the words. You could see his emotional responses in real time. And this reflects a verse in the Quran. وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا. I believe this is from Surah Al-Muzammil, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding the Prophet ﷺ that when he recites in prayer to رَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا, to recite with a measured, like slow, intentional recitation. And this blows my mind as a trauma coach and a neuroscience junkie, because what we've learned through research on the brain is that when you think about the recitation of the Quran, it is slow and there's a bit of a humming that happens when you slow down. That humming sound actually stimulates a nerve, which is one of our cranial nerves, so one of our main nerves that comes, from our brain, called the vagus nerve. And the stimulating of the vagus nerve actually helps us to calm down. It shifts your nervous system into parasympathetic, which is a rest, digest, calm, at ease, safe part of our nervous system. How incredible is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has instructed us to recite Quran in a way that actually benefits our nervous system? And is it no like shortage of a miracle that with all the stress that we are built to endure, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us salah 5 times a day, which includes recitation of Quran, and then he told us how to recite so that we're able to handle the stress of the day. How incredible is that, subhanAllah. With all of that being said, another thing is when you recite in that way, you actually enter into a different brain state. And what I mean by that is we can literally measure this. We could put, electrodes on your head and measure your brain waves and watch them change in real time as you recite. And what's really cool about that is the brainwave state you enter into is the one where you are more creative, where you are more optimistic, where you're able to elaborate several different possibilities. You're a lot more hopeful. And this is a brain state that people try to get into when they're meditating, right? This is what people try to get into when they're visualizing. These things that people do at like really high levels, we're able to access that with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So something super, super powerful to use. That is the end of this video, you guys. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that this was interesting to you. If you like this video, I have one request from you. This is something that could truly change the way so many people see Quran, their relationship with the Quran. If you send this video to one person and they change even one thing from their recitation or their relationship with the Quran because you sent it to them, imagine how much reward you get. So take this video, share it with your friends, share it with your family, share it with even just one person. Hit subscribe if you have not already, and comment below, inshallah. Thank you so much for watching. Assalamu alaikum.